1999, Los Angeles. Fred Karger died at age 87 in his home in the Hollywood Hills. He'd been Marilyn Monroe's voice coach and mentor from 1948 until her death in 1962. 14 years of working together, hundreds of sessions, thousands of hours. When Fred's estate was being settled, his nephew was going through the house, sorting papers, cataloging belongings, and in a locked closet in Fred's study, he found something that shouldn't have existed. Boxes, dozens of boxes, filled with reel-to-reel tapes, and written on each tape in Fred's handwriting were dates and one name, Marilyn. Over 200 hours of recordings, sessions from 1948 to 1962. Every conversation Fred and Marilyn ever had, every voice lesson, every private moment, all recorded without Marilyn's knowledge. When Fred's nephew played the first tape, he expected to hear that famous breathy Marilyn Monroe voice, the soft, childlike, sexy voice that America knew. But what he heard instead stopped him cold. A completely different voice. Deeper, clearer, articulate, intelligent. Nothing like the Marilyn Monroe the world knew. This was Marilyn's real voice. The voice she never used in public. The voice America never heard. And on one tape, dated March 1959, Marilyn said something that explained everything. "I hate that voice, Fred. That baby voice. That's not my real voice. But America wants it, so I give them what they want. Even though every time I use it, I feel like I'm disappearing." This is the untold story of the voice coach, who recorded everything, and the real Marilyn Monroe that those tapes revealed. Fred Karger first met Marilyn in 1948. She was 22 years old, still going by Norma Jane, just starting to get small parts in movies. Fred was a voice coach and composer, worked with actors and singers, helped them develop their vocal technique. A studio executive sent Marilyn to Fred, said she needed help with her voice, that it was too nasal, too flat, needed training. Marilyn came to Fred's studio nervous, unsure. She'd been rejected so many times. Been told she wasn't good enough, wasn't talented enough, and now someone was saying her voice wasn't good enough, either. "Let me hear you speak," Fred said. "Just talk to me normally." And Marilyn spoke, in her normal voice, not the breathy Marilyn Monroe voice that would later become famous, but her natural voice, which was actually quite low, quite strong, very different from what people would come to expect. Fred was surprised. "Your voice is fine," he said. "Better than fine. You have good resonance, good tone. Why does the studio think you need voice training?" Marilyn shrugged. "They said, I sound too normal. They want me to sound more feminine, more innocent, more sexy." And that's when Fred understood. The studio didn't want to fix Marilyn's voice. They wanted to change it, wanted to create a voice that matched the image they were building. The blonde bombshell, the sex symbol, the innocent but sexy girl. Fred should have refused, should have told Marilyn that her natural voice was perfect, should have sent her back to the studio and told them to leave her alone. But he didn't, because Fred was a professional voice coach. And professionals do what their clients ask, even when what they're asking is for you to help destroy something authentic and replace it with something manufactured. So Fred and Marilyn started working together, and Fred installed recording equipment in his studio, told Marilyn it was for her to listen back to her voice, to hear her progress, standard practice for voice training. What Fred didn't tell Marilyn was that he was recording everything, every session, every conversation, every private moment. Years later, in a note found with the tapes, Fred would write, "I knew what we were doing was wrong, changing Marilyn's voice, making her perform even in private, but I wanted documentation, wanted proof of who she really was. before Hollywood completely erased her. The early tapes from 1948 and 1949 show the transformation, show Fred teaching Marilyn to breathe differently, to speak from higher in her throat, to add a slight breathiness to every word, to make her voice softer, lighter, more childlike. On one tape from December 1948, you can hear Marilyn practicing. "No, that feels wrong," Marilyn says, in her natural voice. "I sound like I'm pretending to be a little girl." "That's the point," Fred says. Men respond to that voice. It makes them feel protective, makes them feel masculine. That's what the studio wants. But it's not my voice. It will be. After enough practice, it'll become natural. You won't even have to think about it. And Fred was right. Over months of training, the breathy voice became Marilyn's default. She started using it in auditions, in screen tests, and it worked. Casting directors loved it. Producers loved it. America loved it. By 1950, Marilyn Monroe, the character, was born. Blonde hair, curvy body, and that breathy, sexy, innocent voice. But in Fred's studio, during their private sessions, Marilyn would sometimes forget to use the performance voice, would slip back into her natural voice. And those moments were what made the tapes so valuable, because they showed the real woman underneath the performance. On a tape from 1952, after Marilyn had become famous, you can hear her frustration. "I did 3 interviews today," Marilyn says in her natural voice, "and the whole time I had to use that voice, that fake voice. My throat hurts, my jaw hurts from holding my mouth that certain way." "You could stop using it," Fred suggests. "No, I can't. That voice is part of Marilyn Monroe now. If I suddenly started talking normal, people would be confused, disappointed. They'd say I'm not the real Marilyn." "But you're not the real Marilyn. The real you talks like this." "Nobody wants the real me, Fred. They want the performance. And I'm so good at the performance now that I barely remember who I was before." The tapes from the mid-1950s show something else, show Marilyn working on more serious roles, working on her acting, and her voice work became more complex. For the movie Bus Stop in 1956, Marilyn wanted to do a Southern accent, wanted to show she could act, not just be sexy. On tapes from those sessions, you can hear her practicing, working on the accent with Fred, and when she drops the character, when she talks to Fred about the work, her natural voice comes through, smart, analytical, discussing the character's motivations, the emotional arc, the vocal choices that would convey certain feelings. "Listen to this," Fred's nephew said in a 1999 interview about discovering the tapes. "This is from a bus stop session. Listen to how she analyzes the character. This is not a dumb blonde. This is an intelligent actress doing serious work." On that tape you can hear Marilyn in her real voice. The accent needs to be specific. She's from the Ozarks, so it's not Deep South, it's more Appalachian. And she's young, so some of the vowels should be flatter, more rural, and when she's drunk in the bar scene, the accent should get thicker. People's accents get stronger when they're emotional or intoxicated. That's not the Marilyn Monroe that most people think they know. That's a trained actress with deep understanding of vocal technique and character work. But then when you hear her in interviews from that same time period, she's using the breathy voice, playing dumb, giggling at questions, seeming confused by simple concepts. The contrast is shocking. By the late 1950s, the tapes show Marilyn becoming more and more frustrated with the performance she had to maintain. On a tape from 1958, she's working with Fred on some vocal exercises, and she suddenly stops. "I can't do this anymore," Marilyn says, and she's crying, using her real voice. I can't keep being that person, that character. I feel like I'm losing myself. Like Marilyn Monroe is eating Norma Jane, and soon there won't be anything left. So stop, Fred says. Stop using that voice. Start doing interviews in your real voice. Let people see who you really are. It's too late. I've been Marilyn for too long. If I suddenly change, they'll say I'm having a breakdown. They'll say I've gone crazy. The voice is part of the brand now, and the brand is what makes me money. What makes me famous. I'm trapped. There's a long silence on the tape. Then Marilyn speaks again, very quietly. Sometimes I wish I'd never learned that stupid voice. Wish I'd just stayed Norma Jane. But Norma Jane wasn't good enough. Norma Jane didn't get movie roles. Only Marilyn gets movie roles. The tapes from 1959 to 1962 show Marilyn at her lowest points, show her working with Fred, not on voice technique, but using the sessions almost like therapy, talking about her problems, her fears, her struggles. And in those conversations, she always used her real voice, because Fred's studio was one of the only places where she could drop the performance. On a tape from March 1959, Marilyn talks about doing interviews. I did a radio interview yesterday, and the whole time, I'm using that breathy voice, and the interviewer is asking me these questions like I'm stupid, like I can't understand basic concepts, and I have to play along, have to pretend I don't understand, have to giggle and say, oh, I don't know about that, when he asks about politics or books or anything real. Because Marilyn Monroe isn't supposed to know about those things. She's supposed to be beautiful and empty. But you're not empty, Fred says. No, but Marilyn is, and that's who they want. So that's who I give them, even though it kills me a little bit every time. Some of the most powerful tapes are from sessions where Marilyn is reading. Fred would have her do vocal exercises using different texts, and Marilyn would choose Shakespeare, would choose poetry, would choose complex, challenging material. On one tape, she's reading a passage from Hamlet, and her voice is strong, clear. Her delivery is sophisticated. She understands the text, can convey its meaning with vocal precision. Then Fred says, now read it in the Marilyn voice. And she does, takes the same Shakespeare passage and performs it in the breathy little girl voice. And it sounds ridiculous. The profound words coming out in that affected manner make them meaningless.
See?
Marilyn says back in her real voice. I can't be serious in that voice. I can't be smart in that voice. That voice makes everything frivolous, everything shallow. That voice is a prison. The last tape in Fred's collection is from July 1962, just weeks before Marilyn died. She sounds tired, defeated, and she's speaking in her real voice, but it's weaker than usual, like even her authentic voice is fading. I don't know who I am anymore, Fred. I look in the mirror, and I see Marilyn Monroe, the hair, the makeup, the body, but I don't see me. I don't see Norma Jane. And when I talk, even when I'm alone, sometimes I catch myself using that voice, that fake voice. It's becoming who I am. The performance is becoming the reality, and I don't know how to get back to who I was. Fred tries to comfort her, tells her it's not too late. She can change, can start being herself. But Marilyn just says, you don't understand. There is no self anymore. There's only Marilyn, and I'm so tired of being Marilyn. 6 weeks later, Marilyn was dead. When Fred Karger's nephew discovered the tapes in 1999, he didn't know what to do with them. They were extraordinary. They revealed a completely different side of Marilyn Monroe, showed her intelligence, her artistry, her pain, her real voice. But they were also ethically problematic. Fred had recorded Marilyn without her consent, had captured private moments, private conversations, things Marilyn might not have wanted the world to hear. The nephew consulted with lawyers, with historians, with Marilyn's estate, and eventually decided to release excerpts from the tapes. Not everything. Some conversations were too private, too personal, but enough to show the world what Fred had documented, the real Marilyn Monroe. When the tapes were made public in 2000, the reaction was shock. Music critics and voice experts analyzed them, compared the real voice to the performance voice. The difference is remarkable, one vocal expert said. Her natural voice has more resonance, more depth. She sounds educated, articulate, nothing like the breathy character she played. Actors and directors who had worked with Marilyn were interviewed about the tapes. Many said they'd suspected she was performing even off camera, but they hadn't realized how different her real voice was. Lee Strasberg, Marilyn's acting teacher, had known. In a 1965 interview, before the tapes were discovered, he'd said Marilyn had two voices, the one the public heard, and her real voice, which was quite lovely and much more mature. But she could never use it publicly, because it would shatter the image. People magazine did a feature on the tapes in 2000. Let readers hear clips, and the response was overwhelming. People felt deceived, felt like they'd never really known Marilyn at all. But others felt vindicated, especially women who had always suspected that Marilyn was smarter than she seemed, who had recognized that the dumb blonde act was just that, an act. "I knew she was performing," one fan wrote, "but I didn't realize she was performing all the time. Even in interviews, even in candid moments, she never got to be herself in public, never got to use her real voice. That's so sad." The tapes also revealed something else. In sessions from 1955 to 1962, Marilyn talks about other subjects, about books she's reading, about politics, about philosophy, and she's incredibly well-read, incredibly thoughtful. On one tape, she discusses Dostoevsky with Fred, talks about the brothers Karamazov in depth, analyzes the characters, the themes. Her understanding is sophisticated, graduate level. But in a magazine interview from that same time period, when asked about books, Marilyn giggles and says, "Oh, I like magazines. Books are too long. I prefer pictures." The contrast between the two Marilyns is almost hard to believe, except the tapes prove it, prove that she was performing stupidity, performing shallowness, because that's what was expected of her. Fred Karger never publicly discussed the tapes during his lifetime, but he left a letter explaining why he'd recorded them. "I watched Hollywood destroy Marilyn Monroe," he wrote. "Watched them take an intelligent, talented woman and turn her into a character, a product. I felt guilty for helping with that transformation, for teaching her that voice, that fake voice that imprisoned her for the rest of her life. So I recorded everything, kept evidence of who she really was, hoping that someday people would know, would understand that Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol, was a performance, and Norma Jane, the intelligent, complex woman, was the reality." In 2005, the Smithsonian Museum acquired some of Fred Karger's tapes, put them in their collection, made them available for researchers and historians, and a few clips were made available to the public online. If you listen to them, you can hear the real Marilyn, the one the world never knew, smart, articulate, self-aware, trapped in a performance she could never escape. On one of the final tapes, from June 1962, just 2 months before she died, Marilyn talks about her legacy, about how she'll be remembered. "People will remember Marilyn Monroe," she says in her real voice. "The blonde, the voice, the wiggle, the sex symbol. But nobody will remember Norma Jane. Nobody will remember the real person, because I never let them see her. I performed so well that I erased myself." She was right. For decades after her death, Marilyn Monroe was remembered as the character, the dumb blonde, the tragic sex symbol. But now, because of Fred Karger's controversial recordings, we know the truth. Know that there was a real person underneath, a smart, talented, complex woman who was told to hide herself, to perform, to give the world what they wanted instead of who she was. The tapes are controversial. Many people think Fred was wrong to record Marilyn without her permission, that he violated her privacy, that the tapes should remain sealed. But others argue that the tapes serve an important purpose, that they reveal truth, that they let us finally know the real Marilyn Monroe, the one she never got to show the world. These tapes are Marilyn's voice, one historian wrote. Not the performed voice, not the fake voice, but her actual voice, saying what she actually thought, being who she actually was, and we owe it to her memory to listen, to know that she was more than the character she played. Whether Fred was right or wrong to record those tapes, they exist now, over 200 hours of Marilyn Monroe being herself, using her real voice, speaking honestly, and those recordings have changed how we understand her, changed how we see the breathy, childlike voice she used in movies and interviews. Now when we hear it, we know it's a performance, know there's a different woman underneath, a smarter woman, a more complex woman, a woman who was never allowed to be herself in public. Marilyn Monroe spent her entire career using a fake voice, spent years performing even in moments that seemed candid, and it trapped her, made her feel like she was disappearing, like the performance was erasing the reality. But Fred Karger's tapes preserved something, preserved evidence of who Marilyn really was, what her real voice sounded like, how intelligent she was, how self-aware, how trapped. If this story changes how you hear Marilyn Monroe's voice, subscribe for more untold stories about the woman behind the performance. Hit that like button if you believe people should be allowed to be themselves. And tell us in the comments, did you know Marilyn's famous voice was completely fake? How does this change how you see her? Sometimes the saddest stories are about people who weren't allowed to be themselves, who had to perform every moment of their lives, who had to hide who they really were in order to give the world what it wanted. Marilyn Monroe had a real voice, smart, strong, authentic, but she was never allowed to use it. So she performed, used a fake voice for 14 years, until the performance became the reality, until she couldn't remember who she was underneath. Fred Karger's tapes are the only evidence that the real Marilyn ever existed, the only proof that underneath the breathy blonde was someone else, someone smarter, someone real. And maybe that's why Fred recorded everything, because he knew that without evidence, nobody would believe the real Marilyn had ever existed at all.